So one of the things that I've learned through this book, which this whole process has been very cathartic for my brother and I. We learned a lot about how we ourselves grieved in different situations, and we learned a lot about how each other grieved, and how what I thought I was witnessing in my brother, now that I've read his parts of the book, turned out I misunderstood what I was seeing, which also often happens, is show up, right? Show up. Too often we say to people, hey, call me if you need anything, right? I'm here for you. Call me if you need something. And at the end of the day, they're never going to call, right?
Yep.
So you need to and my wife is great at this. I still struggle with it some because I still, even having written the book and doing the training, I still get a bit intimidated by the awkwardness, the emotionalness, the uncomfortableness of the situations. Yeah. Show up, right? Show up. Don't say, call me. Reach out and contact the person periodically.
This is the Workplace Therapist Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and the entire purpose of this show is one singular thing, and that is to help you have better conversations and build healthier relationships at work. So today's topic is going to be a very important topic. Feels a little heavy, but it's a really important topic for us as leaders to grapple with because it is something that we deal with as individuals, as leaders. Our team members are going to deal with this, and parts of the organization are going to deal with this. We can't avoid it. And the topic is grief. How do we manage and deal with grief? How do we help people as they go through grief? And how do we lead people through grief? So to guide us on this journey, I am so excited to have a wonderful guest, Anthony Casablanca, joining us today. Anthony, really good to have you on the show.
It's such a pleasure, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me on.
And I can't think of a better person to kind of help us through this journey than yourself. So before I ask you to share a little bit about what you do, I want to make sure I get your titles right. Sure. You're the co-founder of Grief Leaders, which is a leadership training company, and then you're also the co-founder. Now you're the co-author of The Dying Art of Leadership.
Correct.
So talk to us a little bit about this idea of grief in the workplace and how you've kind of angled towards that and really help people through that.
Sure. So the first step is to realize just how broad grief really is. Most of the time, the thing that comes to mind for most people is the loss of a loved one, right? A death in the family. But grief is triggered anytime there is an emotionally traumatic event in someone's life that's significant enough to alter their reality, right? So anything, COVID, the isolation that comes along with COVID was emotionally traumatic for people. The financial implications of being out of work for folks and their household incomes shrinking, emotionally traumatic. A significant illness diagnosis is emotionally traumatic enough for people to go through the grief process. And of course, you can't isolate. It would be great if a divorce, someone going through a nasty divorce could leave that at home and come to work and just be themselves. Yeah. But it doesn't work that way. So the first step in this whole process is to realize that a lot of times what we see in behaviors in people is really grief that's playing out, and that we should be aware of that and maybe alter our behaviors a little bit to deal with that on the grief level as opposed to on a performance level.
Yeah. I love that mini simple but profound definition. This any event that can significantly alter someone's reality, which is a really simple but really easy way to identify this. So I want to start talking about elements of grief in the workplace, particularly the stages of grief. But before we do that, I'm just curious, what got you into this in the first place?
Yeah, we get that question a lot. So there's a couple of really interesting things that have gone on in our lives. Somehow, my brother and I both wound up working in the death care industry, right? Yeah. He's 10 years younger than I am. I spent 31 years with a company called Hillenbrand, and their largest subsidiary at the time was a company called Batesville Casket Company, which is the world's largest producer of burial caskets and cremation products. And I spent quite a bit of time in senior leadership positions in that organization. So I saw death care through the eyes of a supplier and through the eyes of the funeral home from the business side. And my brother decided that when my dad passed away back in 1989, he was sort of struggling to find himself. Guy was only 19 when that happened. And he got very intrigued by sort of the technical aspect of the grief process, not the grief process, but the death care process. And the gentleman who's owned the funeral home that my father went through gave Guy an internship, and he thrived in the environment. And so we both wound up in death care. And then about 3 years ago, an article appeared in Harvard Business Review, if I'm not mistaken. And the article was all about grief in the workplace, but it was devoid of any real advice for leaders, right? There was some generalities thrown out in the article, but it didn't really specifically give leaders anything to sink their teeth in. And with my leadership background, the last 12 years of my career, 13 years of my career, I spent in senior leadership positions, VP of Human Resources, Vice President of Global Manufacturing and Supply Chain, and then 3 years as a president of a subsidiary of an operating company. Between all of the things that I had experienced in leadership, all of the things Guy has experienced through his funeral home experience in dealing with grieving families, and then our combined experiences in leadership and working through our own grief in our lives and helping others in the work environment, we thought, we could contribute to this field of grief counseling, if you will, not by being more focused on the individual, but being focused on the leaders who have to lead these people and helping them realize that they are part of this person's support system, not just their boss. And so that's how the book got started. We decided that in order to make that happen, we probably should put our thoughts down in writing. And 2 years ago, we started writing the book, and we finally got it completed after all the research and interviews, and we finally got it completed in August, and it was published in October. So
beautiful, beautiful story. Makes perfect sense. Even more reason why I'm so glad I'm talking to you today. So let's enter into this conversation. I think a good place to start would be equipping us with some good lenses. So what are those stages of grief that we should be on the lookout for when we're kind of walking through kind of the workplace and dealing with our coworkers?
Right. So, keep in mind, this is when you define grief broadly, this is a big problem. I could quickly, just by going through loss of a loved one, a cancer diagnosis, divorce, and opioid addiction, I could get to a number of 17 plus million people a year. If you just assume that one person is affected by either of those, 17 million people a year are showing up to work in a state of grief, just with those examples. That's anywhere between 5 and 8 people. For every 100 people that you have working for you, there's between 5 and 8 of them that are grieving on any given day. And they're doing it silently, right?
Yeah.
So some of the things, and typically the leader sees this play out or doesn't see it play out until there's a performance problem, right? Productivity drops, person's missing meetings, they're taking time off of work. It becomes a performance issue, and most leaders deal with the issue at that point, and they deal with it through the traditional performance improvement processes, which frankly just complicates the problem. So what we suggest and what we try to help leaders understand is, hey, people are going to go through these stages, right? You're going to see them in denial, right? You're going to see them get angry. You're going to see them bargaining, right? They're going to go through these stages where they're not going to believe that this is happening to them. And then they're going to get angry about it. and then they're going to bargain and say, gee, I wish I could have, I wonder if I had, right? Whatever the situation is, right? There's going to be depression. So don't be surprised if you walk by someone's office and they're crying, right? It's natural, right? And then finally, they're going to get to the acceptance stage. But while those are the stages of grief, everyone grieves differently. Everyone responds differently to emotionally traumatic events. And everyone grieves on their own timeline. So it's not like you can just go, oh, okay, Brandon blew up at me today. He's obviously in the anger stage. He must be going to move to bargaining soon. It doesn't work that way, right? It just does not work that way. So we try to educate leaders around these principles and these concepts. There are some who will say that the 5 stages of grief are not relevant anymore. A lot of grief counselors have moved on past the Kubler-Ross model. But what we've found is in real life, those elements, those characteristics, those stages are the ones that you can identify with as someone who's observing, right? So we think they are still very relevant because they are the way things manifest themselves, particularly in the workplace.
It's funny hearing you say that. I had a flashback to an event early in my career. I was working for a company and they had to go through a round of layoffs, and it wasn't handled well because they announced there would be no more rounds of layoffs, and of course then there was another round of layoffs. Right. But when they went through it, their consultants advised that they need to have extra people in the room with the manager who was delivering the message. Right. So I got to be assigned as one of those extra people in the room. And so I literally would go from like one conversation meeting to another one, to another one, to another one.
Right.
And I saw someone who said, nope, you're not firing me. No, this isn't happening. Got up and left. I saw someone said, let's negotiate this. I'm sure we can find a path forward. I saw someone flip the table over. I saw every single stage of grief in that one moment. They all went to different places when they were receiving the same news, but they all moved in different ways.
Right.
And it just kind of a simple story, but reinforces your point that, you're going to see it, and it's hard to predict exactly where someone's going to go and when they're going to go there.
Right. And the other thing that you will see play out is that because grief, you never get over grief, you get through it, right? And every future event tends to have us go back and recall past events, right? So when my mother died, my brother and I both also grieved the loss of my father over again, right? And it took the shape of, wow, we are now the tallest limb on the family tree, right? We went from being a little tiny leaf to now we are the next leaf to fall, right? So we grieved my father's loss as well. Same thing happens in the work environment. Having shut plants down and closed shifts down and done those kinds of things, people go back to, I remember when this happened to me 10 years ago at this company, and here's how they handled it, and all of that emotion and all of those stages of grief come rushing forward and play out all over again in the current event, right? And so, and those moments don't stop there, right? That grief process continues throughout however long it takes someone to finally get to acceptance.
So I hear what you're saying, and it's really powerful stuff, and it's also making this conversation more complicated because now you're looking at a person you're going to deliver news to, but you have no idea what their history is because this is just layered on top of that history. That history could be a little tiny stack. That history could be a giant mountain. And and you just don't know. So this begs probably, if not the big question for today, a big question for today, which is, as leaders, how do we navigate this complicated topic of grief? What can we do to make this either better when we're delivering the message or we're helping someone through it?
Sure. So, it's interesting. We do not deal with this well as a society, right? These are emotional, awkward, uncomfortable conversations, right? And so we'd rather avoid them. And so the very first piece of advice we give leaders is often very counterintuitive. And it's why our leadership training is so important to the process. The first tip we give leaders is actually engage in the process, right? Acknowledge that this emotion is going on and engage the person in the discussion, right? Make the environment one in which they feel comfortable talking about this. In all of our research, our conversations ended in one of two ways, and I'll share the first one right now. Every single person who was treated well said by their leader, I was so thankful that I was able to talk about this at work. It made it so much easier that if I was having a bad day, if things were overwhelming me, I could raise my hand and say, I need help.
Yeah.
Or they said, if they weren't treated well by their leader, they said, I wish I was able to talk about this at work because it would have made it so much easier, right? And so engage, just acknowledge it, give people space, right? And adapt your leadership style to accommodate this, right? Now, I'm not talking about relaxing performance standards,
right?
But keep in mind that grief causes $75 billion a year in lost productivity just in the US alone, right? So recognize that and proactively figure out how to help these folks and support these folks when they need it the most, which leads to the last piece, which is involve the team, right? You're gonna have to go back to the team and say, hey, Brandon is going to need help because he's dealing with some issue. You don't have to be specific, but he's going to need more time off, or we can't overwhelm him with this project, so I'm going to need some of you to pick up a little bit of the slack to give you some space and time to work through whatever it is that's going on in your life, right? Hopefully that answered your question.
It just created more questions for me.
That's fine.
Okay. So I've got some questions that I want to dig in on this because I see this get screwed up all the time in the execution of it. But we're rolling into break. So when we come back, I'm going to challenge you with the question of how do we have that conversation? How does the leader have that conversation? So I want to hear your thoughts on that right after our break.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for listening to the show. In case you haven't heard, Brandon's got a new book out. He's going to tell you all about it.
Thanks, Emily. So the book is The Hot Sauce Principle, How to Live and Lead in a World Where Everything is Urgent All the Time. And if you're like me, and like most of us, everything does feel urgent all the time. It's like hot sauce is being poured on everything, whether it's our work life, our family life, coming from our clients, coming from our boss. And so the book is a practical guide on how do we manage urgency. Not only how do we set proper boundaries, but how do we properly create urgency when we need to. So I wrote the book for you. I can't wait for you to get a copy.
Thanks, Brandon. Don't forget to check out The Hot Sauce Principle, available now on Amazon.com. Back to the show.
Welcome back from break. Of course, this is the Workplace Therapist Show, and I'm your host, Brandon Smith. So our topic today has been grief. And Anthony, right before the break, we were talking about the importance of managers and leaders acknowledging people's grief and creating space for that. I want to go into a little more of the tactical detail of how we have that conversation. Right. Because there are two things that I think are going to be challenges for a lot of leaders and managers. One is the question that I get asked a lot around stuff like this: how much time? I mean, how much time do I need to be sitting with somebody around this? Is this a 5-minute conversation? Is this an hour? Do I do an hour every week? I mean, what's the time amount? Mm-hmm. And then the other one that I often see people do is they're uncomfortable with that person's pain and discomfort, so they want to go in there and fix it. Well, when I went through this process, let me tell you all about what happened when I lost my parents. And then pretty soon it's a 30-minute dissertation on their grieving process that they went through.
Right.
So I imagine that's probably not the right way to handle this. So I would love your thoughts on if you were to kind of give some tips and tricks to leaders and managers on how to do this the right way, whether it's how they have the conversation or how much time to allot for it. What feedback would you give?
Sure. So it's a tremendous question, and actually there are many questions that come off of that question, but I'll try to stay focused in the answer. So actually, this is one of the things. This is the thing that sets our organization apart from all the other leadership training that's out there. We're the only ones that focus on this, right? So everyone else would give you here's a do's and don'ts list, right, for training. In fact, I just read an article in Fortune magazine where an organization, it was all about this topic, and the organization just gave their managers a discussion sheet as their training. Not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. And in our training, we have a couple of things that we do. We put leaders through an assessment to actually help them understand what some of their leadership attributes are and how they would play out in what sort of your natural tendencies are and how that would impact the way you might engage someone. And then we also do we do a lot of role playing, because a big reason that leaders aren't good at this is because nobody has ever talked to them about it. Nobody's ever trained them on it. And so they just don't do it very often. With all of that as a backdrop. So, the first thing is be compassionate, and be willing to engage in the process. Take your cues from the person, right? And certainly don't get into this comparative, I'm going to fix it, let me tell you how you get over this. Last week we posted a video on LinkedIn, and I gave several examples of, the boss who said the best way to get over the death of your father is to get on the plane on Monday morning and go visit your customers. That'll help you get over this. Well, that's not going to help, right? So it's realizing that, and we've heard this a lot of times, right? It's nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care, right? And our take on that, we have a slightly different version of that, which is first you care, then you lead. And people who do it the other way around will have direct reports, but they'll never have followers. And so what you're trying to do here is create an emotionally safe environment where people feel comfortable enough that they can raise their hands and say, I'm struggling. And we actually have a model. It's in our book, The Dying Art of Leadership. We have a model that helps leaders think about and look at what they're seeing, right? And where people are on this matrix to enable them to alter their leadership style, right? Because you're probably going to have to communicate with this person more, right?
Yeah.
More frequently, right? You're not going to be able to just empower them as much as you used to, because they're not fully in the game, right? They're struggling a little bit, right? They're distracted, or they're depressed, or they have all of these emotions going on. And so you have to be willing to be flexible, right? And you have to recognize that just because the person's back at work doesn't mean that they are back to themselves, right? So engage in the discussion, recognize that it'll be emotional, and that's okay. Listen more than you speak is very, very important, right? Don't try to solve it. Don't try to give advice. Listen more than you speak. Be vulnerable. Don't be profound, right? If you're going to share the situation, you can do it by relating, right? But don't say things like, I know what you're going through. You don't know what you're going through. Everybody grieves differently, right? No matter how similar your situation is, you don't really know, right? Don't compare events, right? And just say what's on your heart, and then follow the cues of the person, right? But for God's sakes, don't ignore it and wait for performance to slip and then put the person in a position where their job's being threatened because they're not performing, all because you just let it go way too far, right?
Yeah.
Ironically, if you ever watch any episode of The Undercover Boss, you see this play out in every episode, right? There's at least one person that the undercover boss runs into who is grieving, who is struggling through some emotionally traumatic event. And the boss winds up engaging them in the discussion and learning the story, and then oftentimes making changes to the organization itself as a result. That show serves as a great example of how leaders should handle situations like this.
And I love how you're emphasizing the importance of kind of caring first. And I'm reading a little bit between the lines in this, but it sounds like you're also prescribing that spend more time being present and listening rather than kind of talking and directing through this process.
Right.
It's
right.
More walking alongside them than trying to tell them how they need to get through this.
Exactly. And let them be emotional, whatever that emotion is. Let them be angry let them be angry if they need to be angry.
So I've got, I think, maybe a curveball for you, but my sense is you can probably hit this curveball just fine. And so here's one of the challenges that I often find working with lots of organizations, lots of people. And there may be some gender differences in how they process this, but I commonly will hear phrases like this. Well, I don't want to give the company or my boss any reason to think I'm not ready for the next promotion. Or I don't want to talk about this because it's going to look like I'm weak or I'm not strong or I'm not competent.
Right.
So I really don't want to mention it. I want to just pretend like it doesn't exist. Or it's going to be kind of a big black mark in my file if I accept help for this. So it's almost the other side of the coin. How do we get the person who's grieving to be okay with that process and our help?
Right. It's a great question, and it's actually one of the causes of the problem, which is no matter how many words an organization puts in their mission statement and in their company credo and in their value statement about how they want to treat their people, at the end of the day, most organizations' cultures, particularly if they pride themselves on being high performance organizations, have the culture that you just described, right? I don't care how many days off you give somebody in a bereavement situation. If the manager makes them feel guilty or the culture makes them feel guilty to take those days, it's defeated the purpose, right? So, if it's the individual who feels that way, the leader, and I've been in these situations, right? The leader just has to continue to provide the opportunity for the person to talk about this, right? And the best way to do that is to share with them how when they went through it, they wished that they would have been able to talk about it, right? That's the being vulnerable part, right? Being vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean you have to break out a box of Kleenexes and cry with the employee, right? But it means that you have to share with the employee that if I were in your position, or boy, I know when I went through an event in my life, I wish I would have been able to talk about it at work. And I just want you to know I'm here for you. I am here for you. If anything at all is going on, I want to just come to me, right?
Yeah.
And then don't let that be the last time you have that conversation. Anytime you notice things not quite where the person's behaving a little off kilter, take it as an opportunity to sit down and say, hey, I noticed you were awfully quiet in the meeting. Are you okay? You got a lot going on right now. Just talk to me. Are you all right? Because we want to help you through this, and I just want to make sure you're okay. As you repeatedly have that conversation, the person will feel more and more comfortable about opening up.
That's great. It's a good reminder for us. It's not kind of a one and done kind of thing. It's a process.
It is not.
And you got to be okay with receiving kind of silence as your response, maybe the first couple times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. So I want to kind of pivot this a little bit more into what I'm hearing it from all of the organizations I'm talking to. I have a feeling it's going to be somewhat of a reality for a lot of organizations in the next 6 to 9 months. There's going to be some shifting of organizational structure, which may mean some downsizing, some pruning of limbs, and that's going to be hard, and that's going to involve grief. So if you were to give any kind of advice to leaders as they're making those tough decisions, how do they factor in the grief process, either for the employees who are leaving or for the employees that are staying?
Right. Which is a great point, because we oftentimes forget about the people who are staying, who all are worried about when's the next shoe going to drop, or what's the next benefit that's going to get taken away, or who's next to be laid off. Right.
Yeah.
And so they become very cautious, and they will grieve as well. Right. So, it's funny that you bring this up, because I've been in multiple conversations this week with folks who have read our book and reached out to me about this very topic. Right? There's a reduction in force going on, and here's how they're handling it, and it doesn't seem like whatever the situation is or whatever. So leaders get taught and get measured on execution. And that's great, right? So I don't want your listeners to think, well, here's another bleeding heart former HR guy who thinks that we should measure the world through a happiness scale and not ever do anything difficult in the work environment. Couldn't be further from the truth. I've been the guy at the top who has to be the one who delivers the news that we're shutting down a plant, closing a shift, all of those things, right? So I get it. I really get it. But don't confuse, and I think this is missed a great deal by organizations, right? They develop their communication plans, but they miss the fact that if you were to go out and search the steps of change management, you will see models out there that mirror the Kubler-Ross, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. So they need to factor in the emotional piece, right? They need to think about, they need to make sure that they're not confusing denial with resistance, right? That's not the same thing, right? And that they're not confusing depression with a performance problem, right? That's not the same thing. We shut a facility down in the Northeast, 192 people, and my sole job was to fly up there. We plotted every single person in the organization on the matrix that is in our book. And my sole job was to fly up there every single week. And we identified the people who were likely to be the most vulnerable or in the deepest stages of grief. And my job was to fly up there and make sure that I met with them every single week, talk to them about what they were feeling, how they were doing, did they need any help, got them help with resume building or understanding retirement programs, or, right? It's really one-on-one communication. After the announcement, you gotta leave space and time to talk individually with your people and ask them how they're feeling. What are you feeling? Talk to me. I can't help you if you won't talk. So let's talk about this, right? That would be my biggest piece of advice is just never forget that these are people, and don't confuse the emotions you're seeing with resistance or an unwillingness to accept change or performance issues, right? It's just people trying to deal with the new reality, and you need to give them space and time to do that, and an avenue to raise their hand and say, boss, I can't deal with this. I need a little time off, right? Or I need a little time away, or I just need to go outside and cry, right? Yeah. All of that is fine.
So I want to overly simplify it. Hopefully I'm not missing the point, but here's what I heard in this. I think what a lot of leaders do, I see them do, is they say, okay, we're going to make this decision. We want to kind of set our people up, for success later. So we're going to make the announcement, let everybody go tomorrow, but then give them all, resume building, and that's part of the package. So we just say,
Right.
sorry, it's your last day. Here's your package. It's very generous. Good luck to you. And while that package on the back end can be helpful, part of the process, what's missed in that is time. Time for them to grieve the process on their own, but also time for you to invest in them in that relationship to show that you care.
Right.
And then you can give them the package at the end, but don't forget that important window in the middle where they need that time to process, and you connecting with them is an important part of that process. So there's an investment of time that has to happen that I think, in the kind of the, whether people want to avoid that discomfort or they're just trying to move fast, they're favoring efficiency, they cut out that important piece. So that was what I heard in that. Does that sound fairly on point for you?
So it is. So in that example where we shut down the facility, much to the chagrin of many in the leadership organization, as part of the leadership, we gave those people a year's notice.
Wow.
And of course, everyone was scared to death of sabotage and violence and vandalism, and we gave those people a year's notice. I flew up every week to chat with them. And at the end of the day, that plant hit every one of its cost, quality, safety, and delivery targets every month for the entire year. There was no vandalism. There was no sabotage. And they were a union plant. So we had a union element going on in the background. So you're exactly right. And the reason we did that was, one, I happened to work, at the time, I worked for a VP of HR who was a phenomenal person, a great coach and mentor to me, and just always was focused on doing the right thing, not following procedure, right? There's a difference between doing what's right and doing the right thing, right?
Yep.
And he always set aside procedure to do what was right. And through that, we were able to take care of it. We recognized that there were 2,300 other people in other parts of the organization that were watching how we handled these 192.
Yeah.
And that's a piece that often gets missed, right? We're so worried about the 200 that we're going to let go, and we don't want anybody to screw around with the computer system or anything. So we tell them to box up all that crap and get out. But you have the rest of the organization that looks at that and goes, wow, is that how they treat us around here? We're just a collection of stuff to put in a box and escort out of here. They don't really care about us as people.
Yeah.
So, yes, time, space, compassion, all of those things matter when you're dealing with emotionally traumatic events and people who have been emotionally traumatized.
Yeah. Anthony, this conversation was absolutely great and very timely. So I always ask all my guests this last question. What's one life hack you have for us for how we can have better or healthier conversations, either at work or at home?
Interesting. I've not been asked that one before. So one of the things that I've learned through this book, which this whole process has been very cathartic for my brother and I, we learned a lot about how we ourselves grieved in different situations. And we learned a lot about how each other grieved and how what I thought I was witnessing in my brother, now that I've read his parts of the book, turned out I misunderstood what I was seeing, which also often happens, is show up, right? Show up. Too often we say to people, hey, call me if you need anything, right? I'm here for you. Call me if you need something. And at the end of the day, they're never going to call, right?
Yep.
So you need to, and my wife is great at this. I still struggle with it some because I still, even having written the book and doing the training, I still get a bit intimidated by the awkwardness, the emotionalness, the uncomfortableness of the situations. Yeah. Show up, right? Show up. Don't say, call me. Reach out and contact the person periodically, right? Yeah. I'm doing this now with a friend of ours who has a daughter who's going through cancer treatment. Just every so often I pick up my phone, text them, hey man, how you doing? I'm here for you. how's your daughter doing? How are the treatments going? And what I'm looking for in his text is not that if he says, oh, things are fine, I'm probably going to call him because things aren't fine, right? I know that because our son went through cancer treatments and I know what that's like. So I know it's not fine. But as long as he's sharing and talking and giving me some insight into what he's feeling and how his family's doing, texting may be just fine, right? We've invited him over for dinner, just for a break. Come on over for dinner, right?
Yeah.
So show up, right? Really be there. Words, actions speak louder than words. And telling somebody I'm here to help you, and then never doing anything or responding in any way proactively to actually help, which is a big piece of what we talk about in the book, doesn't matter, right? Doesn't matter. And I had an example last night of a friend who reached out, and they're very concerned about how people, supposedly, the organization is very concerned about how people are dealing with the isolation, working from home. This is a medical environment, so this person is dealing with a lot of COVID claims and people who have died. And she made the comment, she said, in every meeting they ask us how we're doing, but it's obvious that they don't really want to know because it's buried in the spreadsheet talk, right? It's sort of like, hey, how's everybody doing? I hope fine. Let's talk about the spreadsheet, right? Or after we talk about the spreadsheet for an hour and a half, then the person says, how's everybody doing? Well, hell, everybody wants to get off the phone at that point, and nobody wants to talk. And what winds up happening is they're talking amongst themselves, right? And they're sharing their emotions, which is great, but it's setting up an environment where they need to be able to talk about it with their boss, because at some point performance is going to get impacted, and then the boss is going to step in thinking everything's fine when it's really not.
Yeah. I love that. Great examples, but that profound statement of just show up. So Anthony, this was incredible. If people want to learn more about you, buy a copy of the book, learn more about the good work that you and your company are doing with leaders,
sure,
where can they go?
Sure. So they can visit our website at griefleaders.com. They can find out a lot about what we do and who we are and why we do it. There's also a link there to buy the book. They can buy the book on Amazon. So you can go to Amazon, search The Dying Art of Leadership, and the book will come up. And of course, they can follow us on LinkedIn, reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn. Be more than happy to invest some time helping people think through this incredibly important and often an overlooked and undertaught challenge of leadership.
Yeah, Anthony, this was great. Again, thank you for coming on the show. And thank you all for listening and watching. Of course, continue every week as we keep up the fight against kind of workplace dysfunction and helping our conversations be that much healthier and our relationships get that much healthier. And if you haven't rated or reviewed the show, please do. That's how we grow our tribe and grow followers. Of course, you can always go to my site, theworkplacetherapist.com, for additional resources, past blogs, articles, podcasts. And if you haven't bought a copy of my newest book, The Hot Sauce Principle, How to Live and Lead in a World Where Everything is Urgent All the Time, you should. Yeah, I wrote it for you. So until our next show, have a great week and an awesome life.